Well, I can't say I'm surprised, but it seems as though we have the most damning evidence that Facebook is in fact a U.S. government cutout, essentially a thinly veiled private sector arm of the American deep state. And before I get into the specifics of that, for those of you who are unfamiliar, I've made this case in the past, but I think that it is it's very naive to look at a company like Facebook or Twitter, or really any of these large, I won't call them tech monopolies, because that's not exactly, I don't think that that's an appropriate term to use when referring to these tech companies, but the tech giants are not really private sector entities in the same way that the corner store on Main Street is, or the way that your pool guy or is a private company, or that your air conditioning business is a private company. Facebook and Twitter, these tech companies, have been deeply involved and intermingled with the United States government, with the intelligence community, with the police for a long time. And I can't pinpoint exactly when it started, but it should be pretty obvious that the tech sector would be heavily compromised and infiltrated by the intelligence community, simply because of the massive data revolution that they ushered in. The way that companies like Facebook and Google were able to amass unprecedented amounts of data on individual Americans and people around the world, it's far more expansive than the spying that old school agencies and secret police forces like the Stasi or the KGB were capable of. And so naturally, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA are all going to want to have a hand in this new data revolution, and the overlap between government and the tech industry, the real union between them, is perhaps more clear if you look at Israel, where the intelligence community in Israel explicitly owns a lot of tech firms. Actually, most of the tech industry is run by the Israeli intelligence community. But Israel is America's little brother, so it's possible, or it's useful to try and use that and extrapolate a little bit to the United States, even though it works a little different here because we don't literally have the CIA own 51% of the shares in Facebook. They just have compromised the people who do own those shares. And so what we saw today is people are now posting screenshots. I saw them on Twitter. I'm sure that if you post them on Facebook, you probably will get flagged and have your post deleted. But Facebook is now sending people these push notifications saying, ooh, do you think that someone is spouting extremist rhetoric or is going down a radical path? Here's a hotline you can call to report them. Here's how you can rat on your Facebook friends if you think that they are guilty of wrongthink. And then there was another thing that they're sending out to where they're warning people if they were in fact exposed to extremist behavior and saying, hey, warning, you were exposed to extremist rhetoric or extremist posts, extremist content, and you might become a victim of radicalization. So here's a hotline you can call to rat on yourself, to report yourself and say, please help me, please re-educate me, and make sure that I don't become a dissident who opposes the American regime. And this comes just as the U.S. government is beginning its new domestic war on terror that they announced after the inauguration of Joe Biden. And this, of course, begins, at least they would like us to think, going back to the January 6th riot, which they're trying to make the new 9/11, which 9/11, of course, was the new Pearl Harbor, to quote the Project for a New American Century. And so, we've been seeing things coming out of the intelligence community. I went over something a week or two ago talking about, the new kinds of extremists and things that they're looking out for. And Facebook clearly is doing their part. They are a part of this rollout, and they are acting on behalf of the regime in this new domestic war on terror. Facebook, of course, they know, they have algorithms to identify people who are dissidents, who they would consider to be, potential domestic terrorists and things, who are guilty of wrongthink. And so I think that it's redundant to have this hotline for people to contact them and report their friends. But what this is meant to do, I think, is actually more to condition people to get more used to ratting on their friends, which, of course, I think it was Michael Malice today on Twitter pointed out, the state did a lot to help condition people in that direction towards ratting on their neighbors during the whole COVID thing, where it gave anyone who was walking down the street without wearing a mask, their neighbors could call the police and report on them, depending on what jurisdiction you're in. And that gave ordinary, very unimpressive people a sense of power and superiority over their neighbors. And so this new see something, say something culture that they're trying to breed with regard to right-wingers is a way of making dissidents in this country, or dissidents, into pariahs. And so I think that second screenshot that I identified, and, maybe I'll try and find the original link to the tweet, but I don't know. I'm very tired tonight, and I don't think I'll have time to try and hunt it down. But it's floating around, and, if somebody really asks in the comments, maybe I'll go and try and find the link if you can't find it yourself. But that second screenshot, which says, hey, you were exposed to extremist content. Hey, call this hotline if you need help. That to me shows that they know who the dissidents are. They can identify that. They have an algorithm that catches that very easily, and will flag whoever is who is a potential threat to the state, as they see it. So they don't need people to report on them. But what this is a way of confirming, of affirming your loyalty to the state. By calling and ratting on someone, you're saying, hey, it's just like what they used to do in East Germany. People used to rat on their neighbors just to prove to the government how loyal they are to the government. Even if their neighbors didn't do anything wrong, they knew, hey, if I'm not ratting on other people, people will rat on me. And so I think that for the time being, we're entering what's going to be a much more difficult period in American history, or at least that's what the U.S. deep state, with the intelligence community, whatever you want to call them, the FBI, CIA, NSA, all of these various alphabet agencies, even your local police, depending on the extent to which they buy into the state ideology, or rather the state religion, the religion of Washington. They want to make it difficult for people who disagree. Now, they haven't made thought crime a de jure reality, but they've just about made it a de facto reality. So while they can't really prosecute you per se for being a dissident, for opposing the state, they can do everything short of that at this point. They can try and ostracize you. They can make your friends and your neighbors think that you're a very bad person, and they can encourage your friends and neighbors to disassociate from you because, of course, you're a domestic terrorist, and so, who wants to be associated with a domestic terrorist? And bringing this back to Facebook, there should be no illusions at this point that Facebook is some kind of private entity with its, just acting in its own rational self-interest. Facebook is acting in the interest of the state because Facebook is an arm of the state to a certain extent. Yes, Mark Zuckerberg wants to turn a profit, but he understands that he's going, or at least he believes, that his company is going to do much better serving the interests of Washington rather than trying to act as an entity separate from Washington, in which case it would be treated as a threat. I think back to, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something Bill Gates said about how his greatest mistake in business was thinking that you could just make it in America by starting a good business and selling a good product. And that, Steve Jobs understood, much better than Bill Gates that, the way that you get ahead is by currying favor with the powerful and ingratiating yourself amongst them. And again, remember, Steve Jobs, very cutthroat businessman. I don't know who's worse, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, But one of them is remembered as a god, the other is remembered as either a creepy nerd at best or a creepy demon at worst. And the difference is that way back in the 80s, Steve Jobs, opened lobbying or got involved with lobbying in Washington and ingratiating himself amongst the powerful and the Washington elite. Bill Gates did not do that, and Bill Gates was the one who ended up, with an antitrust case against him. Facebook, on the other hand, is having antitrust cases dismissed by judges. And so Facebook would be wise to try and serve the interests of the state. Antitrust, even though I guess we'll call them the nationalist populists, have a renewed interest in antitrust law, which is totally bunk. It was always corrupt. This is a good example of that. The state can use antitrust law to ensure that they punish those corporations who do not get in line, who do not, who are the wrong monopolies, essentially. They have good monopolies, and there was always, going back to the days of Teddy Roosevelt, the great nationalist populist hero. There were good monopolies to him and bad monopolies, and the bad monopolies were the ones who were not politically aligned with him, who were not affiliated with his buddy J.P. Morgan. For example, the monopolies that were associated with John D. Rockefeller. But J.P. Morgan's monopolies, U.S. Steel, International Harvester, he had no problem with those. In fact, U.S. Steel and International Harvester still exist today. Well, International Harvester's kind of been split off and sold a few times, but U.S. Steel still exists. You know what doesn't exist? Standard Oil. And so you look at a company like Parler, and you say, well, gee, did Amazon shut them down because, Amazon, they're a bunch of left-wingers, and they didn't like that these right-wingers started their own website. And so that's why Amazon shut them down, and because Amazon has this big contract with Twitter, and they just have these conflicting, business interests. So it's all private sector. Or is it that Amazon, Twitter, Facebook, these are all guys who are ingratiated in the elite class, members of the elite class. They are arms of the state. They work hand in hand with the state. This is sort of the nature of having a corporate state. You have companies, you have private companies, and you have the government. And there's not really a solid line separating the two. And so you have Parler come in, and while Parler was not the most effective or the most strident dissident company, or the most strident dissident social media website, they were nevertheless far less affiliated and far less willing to acquiesce to the state and to serve the state's interests. And so therefore, they were deemed a threat and eliminated. And so when you're trying to analyze the actions of the state, you have to look more broadly than just, who's writing the check. Is this person a paid employee of the United States Treasury? Is that who writes their paycheck every week? Because just because they are not doesn't mean that they are not a part of the state. I mean, look at the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. That is a NGO. It's a non-governmental organization completely funded by the U.S. Congress. It is a U.S. cutout that is essentially a private sector CIA. That's what, and there's a lot of folks who are funded by the NED. And you would say, well, gee, they're private entities. Well, no, if they're funded by the NED, you're essentially a CIA puppet. And there's all sorts of cutouts. There's all sorts of ways in which the U.S. government works its influence into organizations and people who are not directly affiliated with the state. We in the United States have a corrupt oligarchy similar to that of Russia, or of the example that I always like, rather than using other modern examples, was the Estado Novo under Salazar in Portugal, in which Salazar was very closely aligned with various business interests in Portugal, and those business interests were aligned with the state. they worked together. They were not independent of one another. These companies that were selective, or that were, chosen and favored by the state, they got certain privileges, and in exchange, they offered their loyalty to try and advance the interests of the state. That is the nature of a corporatist economic system or political economic system. We do not have capitalism, we do not have socialism. Those terms are academic. We haven't had either of those things in any country in a very long time. Corporatism has been the dominant model going back really to World War I. It was originally what was called war socialism. It was actually arguably pioneered by the Confederates during the Civil War, and it was expanded upon during World War I, and then that became the foundation. The World War I economic model, war socialism, became the economic foundation for Mussolini's fascism, although you do not want to necessarily conflate corporatist economics with fascism. Just because you have corporatist economics does not make you a fascist country, because even though fascism, in my opinion, died at the end of World War II, it is best looked at as a historical phenomenon. The corporatist economic model has lived on and thrived and continued to expand ever since. I think that modern America has much more in common with Mussolini's Italy or Salazar's Portugal economically than they do the United States of the 19 teens. Now, I didn't really intend to go off on this much of a tangent about economics. I was trying to distance myself, since I've been talking about the economy a lot lately, but this was still important, so I'm going to leave all of this in. But I do want to bring things back to the focus of what I originally started talking about, and that was spying. And what I want to drive home today is that you can't. We're past the point where people are permitted to just live their lives being apolitical. People are being forced to choose by the system. Either you are with the regime or against the regime. They're making you choose, and even if you don't actively choose, the algorithm will choose which side you're on, and that makes this a very dangerous time. And so, try your best to keep your head down. I think that is probably the best idea, and to the extent that you can, try and educate the people you care about, the people around you, about the nature of what's going on. You're not going to, educate some apolitical person overnight about these matters. But if you just start pointing out things that are, because things are so blatant right now, you'll help inoculate them against state propaganda. Because otherwise, if you don't inoculate the people around you, eventually they will be turned into weapons against you. Never think to yourself that it can't happen here. The Germans, if you meet the Germans who were alive during World War II, or the Russians and the other, Soviet peoples who were alive during the era of Stalin, or even after that, and if you took them out of that situation and you placed them and let them grow up in a different society, they would be totally normal people. So while we still can, it's incumbent upon anyone who is aware of what's going on to do what they can within reason to stand up against this and combat it. Don't make yourself a martyr yet, unless it's a really important issue. For example, if you're one of these guys who were sentenced by a judge to be vaccinated, do everything in your power to resist. Make yourself a martyr. Turn down the plea deal. That's something that I think is worth being martyred over. But, edgy memes on Facebook, not necessarily a hill that I'd be willing to die on. But we're far past the point to where Facebook is just getting rid of people because of edgy memes. They're making it much more explicit, and they want you again to become a pariah. They want the people around you to think that there's something wrong with you, that you're sick, and that you need help, and that they need to call this hotline. So I guess I need to do some more thinking on how best to address people who are, again, normies, who are encountering that, who are being told that about you. When Facebook tells your friends that you're a bad person, or that you're sick, that you need help, how should you talk to the people around you about that? How do you convince them that, no, there's nothing wrong with me, there's something wrong with them? It's something to consider. So until then, I guess I'll leave it off there for today, and I'll see you folks back here tomorrow. I'm going to be uploading this in the morning. I'm just too tired to upload it tonight. But it should be up early tomorrow, and then I'll try and have a second video out in the afternoon. I guess I'll leave it there.